Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome back Shivana Naidu. She's a child psychiatrist. Today's KevinMD article is titled The Cactus Kid, an analogy for parents and youth who are living with mental disease. Shivana, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin.
So Shivana's been on multiple times. Go to kevinmd.com/podcast. Upper right-hand corner, there's a search icon. You could search for her name in prior episodes. But today, let's get right into your latest KevinMD article. How did it come together?
Absolutely. So, as a child psychiatrist, I see kids every day. And part of my work with kids is to help them understand what are they going through, how come they're going through it, and how do they understand that thing happening to them as a part of their life. And what I've found, and this is how the article really came together, is that lots of young people would come to me saying, I have ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
I have bipolar. And then parents as well would come and say, my kid can't go out because they have anxiety. And I started to kind of recognize, and I think most psychiatrists who work with kids and therapists that work with kids realize that how we speak to our kids impact how they think about themselves. So I wanted to draw an analogy to have people kind of think about the process of mental health and how this really impacts the development of a child and the understanding of that child's own development. So I drew this analogy of a cactus. I live in Arizona. I
Yeah.
used to live in New York City where there are roses all over the place. And now in Arizona, I've appreciated the unique desert flora and fauna, which include cacti. And it made me think about how the environment of being in the desert has really shaped these cacti to grow, these prickles, these burrs that make it really hard to live with them. And I think a lot of parents experience this with their own children, that they feel having anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
ADHD, bipolar makes it really hard to parent, which it totally does. It is very difficult to parent a child that has a mental health disorder. And by perpetuating some of these labels, I think it actually encourages these kids to grow more prickles,
Mm.
grow more burrs, and have a harder time with letting people in. So, if you read through this article, it kind of speaks about how we can reconceptualize the idea of what we can do, what can we change in the environment to help what used to be a rose and is now a cactus grow back into something more beautiful and softer, gentler, more authentic.
Sure.
Because, I think about these kids that I've dealt with who go through mental health issues. How must they feel? They don't feel good. They feel the prickles on the inside. They don't feel good about themselves. And it's really challenging for them to grow up and figure out, who am I? Because as young people, especially teenagers, that 12 to 18 period, if we go back to developmental psychology and developmental stages, this stage is identity versus role confusion. This is where they form, who am I? What am I? Why am I the way that I am? Who am I bringing forth into the world as an adult? So I think this is also where a lot of issues with taking medications, going to receive treatment, declining treatment come into play. And that's not just for mental health. This happens for neurology, for cancer, for
Mm.
hypertension, for diabetes, for all sorts of juvenile disorders where young people have to take responsibility and take medication. And there's this back and forth about whether to take something externally to make them good or whole or healthy. This dynamic comes into play, this identity versus role confusion. Who am I? What am I with or without this medication, this external thing? So that's kind of where this article came from, to just kind of have parents and young people think about this critically, because I think as we continue with the current mental health care youth crisis, more and more young people are being faced with what it means to live with depression, which is one of the leading causes of disability as an adult. And more young people are coming to terms with what it means to navigate life with undermanaged mental health disorders. So who are they as a young person? Who will they be as an adult? What does their future look like? And I think how we speak to our kids as professionals, as physicians, as parents, all affect how kids think about themselves and our future. The future of our world really depends, in my mind, on this discussion of identity.
So before we talk about reframing childhood mental health, give us some examples of some of the things that parents and peers would typically say to kids who are dealing with behavioral health issues, just to illustrate some of the issues that you're mentioning.
Oh, yeah. So I think that, young people who maybe don't even have mental health care disorder. I think in colloquial American culture, we use difficulty with focusing as, oh, it's just my ADHD acting up.
Okay.
We use having typical mood swings, feeling down because we're disappointed as, oh, it's my bipolar. I must be bipolar because I'm crying and I don't know why I'm crying. So I think it's not just those of us who are dealing with mental health disorders, but those of us in normal life. We have normalized using these labels to understand who we are. And in one aspect, that normalization is helpful because it makes those of us who have bipolar, anxiety, ADHD, for example, be less stigmatized. And it also, unfortunately, on the other side, prevents us from having a normal range of reactions as okay and part of the human experience. I can cry and not be bipolar. I cannot be focused and not have ADHD. There are times where I'm going to be overwhelmed and not focused. And I think that it kind of forces the spectrum of the human experience into these diagnostic boxes, which it was never intended to do. You know, the DSM-5, which is kind of like our psychiatric Bible, and was designed to be used as a way for psychiatrists and professionals to speak in a language that captured certain symptoms, has now been adopted by culture to just explain life. And that's not really how it's supposed to be.
And go into more detail about how this language, how these terms, how this verbiage affects these children.
So tons of times where I work right now, I work in a PHP, which is a higher, it's a level of care between outpatient clinic and inpatient psychiatric admission. So we kind of fit in between. It's a very rare but fantastic form of treatment for high intense kids who have high emotional needs and are high acuity. But we have a lot of young people who are avoiding school, right? It's September, school just started on the East Coast, and a lot of kids have this honeymoon phase where school's good for a couple of weeks and then they don't want to go back because school is so horrible. My own son this morning says, I don't want to go to school. But school avoidance is a very big challenge for a lot of young people, high school, middle school, elementary school, and it's been exacerbated by COVID. So a lot of young people will say, and parents will say, my anxiety prevents me from going to school. Yes, and your anxiety is a part of normal development that was developed inherently. We evolved with it to help protect us from fearful and dangerous situations. But school is not that dangerous situation. Now, we will leave school shootings to the side because some kids do have fears because of that, and that is a true fear and legitimate. But I think in general, a lot of these young people are not going to school for other fear factors that get exacerbated. It prevents them from finishing school, from socializing, from being able to test the waters and demonstrate their ability to be successful in life, because school is where kids test themselves and show themselves and learn how to grow. So I think that that's just one example of how the idea of anxiety and attaching themselves to having anxiety gets in their way of being successful. And I think that's the case also with a lot of young people that have mood disorders. They will explain the reason why people don't like them because of their bipolar. I have had several young women, for example, with a true bipolar disorder, not just saying bipolar, but true bipolar or depression, get into and out of many relationships and blame that mental health disorder on the reason why they can't have a good relationship. And then that disorder is them. So my bipolar versus I have bipolar. My bipolar makes me not a good girlfriend. I'm never going to have a partner that cares about me. And then that kind of perpetuates in the future who they feel they're worth being with or having. So it has long-lasting impacts into the future hopefulness of youth and their potential for growth.
Now, they are getting exposed to this language, like you said, from parents or peers. What about things like social media, which is the other area that kids get a lot of exposure from? What are you seeing on social media in terms of perpetuating this language?
So it's interesting because I do think that one of the benefits of Gen Zers, youth, is that they are trying to fight against the stigma of mental health. They are more than before, lots of influencers, lots of celebrities are talking about their own mental health care struggles. Selena Gomez just had her biography out. And I think that is helpful to, again, open the door of talking about human experience and that we all go through ups and downs. But I also think that, again, there's this fine line, as I touched upon before, between the normalization of going through ups and downs and then having a diagnostic impairing disorder.
Mm.
So I think that it is better to talk about it than not to talk about it. It's better to discuss what that label means than to ignore that it's there at all. And that's also the case with suicidal thinking and thoughts. It's a suicide prevention month here in September. But I do think that where we get our information is also important. And I truly value everyone's individual experiences, and that is oftentimes a representation of a greater collective, but still not necessarily what the greater collective is. And that's why we have to still have some form of evidence-based intervention and assessment. And there is still a value for what trends are versus just that individual experience, because one person may really be strongly identifying with having a certain diagnosis and that serves them well, but that may not be the case for everyone. And I think that although there's a subset of population really making great strides with talking about mental health disorders online through social media, there also are many of those who are still trying to understand and wrap their minds about what that is. And the other peers who are still thinking that's weird, that's strange, they don't fit in, they're just odd, they're emo, whatever language it is. So I think that we still have a long way to go, but we've made great strides. And I think the other challenge is that because of our stages of understanding, below age 12 and above age 12 are very different ways of thinking. And of course, every child has their own individual trajectory. There are lots of very advanced 12-year-olds and very immature 12-year-olds as well. But on social media, who is giving that information and who is observing that information, that interface is variable. So a very young child being exposed to that kind of language and what that means and what they think it may mean is very different than an older child who can manage it and really think about it and be critical. So I think that that's the other thing to watch for our youth, and how capable are they to really be exposed to this idea, whatever idea it is, and then think about it versus just take it as fact. And, I'll give the example of my own kids. My kids are young, they're 5 and 8, but my 5-year-old right now, everything is fact. Whatever they see on the computer, this is real.
Yeah.
My 8-year-old is now beginning to question, how real is that? And he's only beginning to question it because my husband and I are encouraging him to question it. If we didn't know he was watching and just let him watch it, that would just be what is. So I think that we have to really engage with our children and remind them to be critical about what they observe, and critical about and curious about what is being shown and how real that actually is.
So in terms of next steps, and you started talking about this in terms of being more critical in terms of what we see and what we hear, how can we, as you said before, reconceptualize that framework? What are some solutions to the issue that you bring up?
Oh, I wish I had a solution. It's tough. I think that the first thing is awareness. I think we as parents have to be aware of what they're watching. And 2, we have to teach critical thinking skills, which I think in school, sometimes we wait a little too long to teach kids this. I think very early on, we need to have young people think about, where are they getting their information? What is the trusted source? Is it a trusted source? And if it isn't, where can we turn to get that trusted source? So I think we need to build natural curiosity into the minds of our youth versus just accepting it as face value. And I think, unfortunately, it's not being mirrored in our adult world as well. Too often, we as adults take that information as face value and don't go the further step. So I think that just kind of starting to question and be curious and encourage that innate curiosity, that scientific thinking that all kids have, is what we need to continue to encourage as they grow older.
And then from a parent standpoint, what can parents do in terms of addressing behavioral health issues in youth? Is it simply just not using that type of language and verbiage? What kind of advice can you give to parents when talking to their children about behavioral health issues?
Absolutely. So I always encourage parents to first listen to themselves. And I am working on this. I'm not perfect, because sometimes the things that come out of our mouths can really be very stigmatizing and can be polarizing versus opening a door. We want to open a door. So very often I've heard parents say things like, I want to kill myself because of whatever situation, right? It's a colloquial phrase. But for a depressed child, this might not be the best thing to say. Or, it's my ADHD. My ADHD is acting up. I can't focus on this right now. When it's 7:00 on a Thursday night and you still have work the next day, of course you're going to be unfocused. So minding your language is an important thing. The other thing I think is to create opportunities to open up the door to have youth speak to you at any age, whether that is at the dinner table, whether that's driving in the car, whether that's sharing a meal. Find the time to put your phone down and just really focus on them. And I think I've said this on other podcasts too. I have a very talkative 5-year-old, and I have to remind myself to do that. But it's so important to look them in the face and say, hey, I hear you, I see you, I value you. And I do have 2 courses on my website, Do Better MD, where I have workshops particularly for parents to learn how to talk to their child if they're concerned about suicide and what to do to keep their home safe, because it's really difficult to know what to do. And when we as parents are aware that our child is struggling with whatever it is, from suicide all the way down to anxiety, we are really jostled, and we want to do the right thing and we don't want to do the wrong thing. And oftentimes we just do what comes naturally, which may not always be the best thing. I think that as parents, if we know better, we can do better. We can help our parents and our children to feel better by giving them those tools and knowledge and guidance to take a different path.
We're talking to Shivana Naidu. She's a child psychiatrist. Her KevinMD article is titled The Cactus Kid, an analogy for parents and youth who are living with mental disease. Shivana, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience.
So my take-home message for this particular article would be that youth who are struggling with some mental health challenge, we're not yet sure if it's a disorder or just a phase. Let's be curious about it. Let's ask about it. Let's not just label it too quickly. I think the other take home is that as parents, let's be aware of how we speak to our children. Let's encourage them to see themselves as that rose, even if they're experiencing a cactus phase. And finally, I do have some workshops. If you're really concerned about your child having suicidal thoughts, please do look on my website for those, and always go to a pediatrician. Call 988 or 741-741 if you're really concerned for a mental health care crisis. We have, as a nation, risen to the challenge of addressing the current youth mental health crisis, and help is here.
Shivana, thank you again for coming back on the show and sharing your time and insight.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I appreciate your work. Thank you for all that you do.